At 9:30 on the morning of June 9th, 1944, Dr. Ferdinand Porsche stood beside a metal behemoth in a testing facility at Böblingen, southwest of Stuttgart. He was 68 years old and he was looking at the largest tank ever built. The machine beside him weighed 188 metric tons. Its hull stretched nearly 11 meters long. Its turret alone weighed more than an entire Sherman tank. The armor at the front was 220 millimeters thick. No Allied weapon in existence could penetrate it. Porsche placed his hand on the cold steel. This was his creation, his answer to the Tiger, to the Panther, to everything that had come before. The Panzerkampfwagen VIII Maus. The Maus. The name was a joke. Nothing about this machine was small. In his jacket pocket was a letter from Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments. The letter contained bad news. Production was being cancelled. Only 2 prototypes would ever be completed. What Porsche did not know, as he watched the Maus crawl across the testing ground at a walking pace, was that his masterpiece would never fire a shot in anger. It would never crush an enemy tank. It would never change the war. The heaviest tank in history would become the heaviest monument to futility, proof that in war, bigger does not mean better. The warning had come 2 years earlier from an unlikely source. In June 1942, at a meeting of the Army Weapons Office in Berlin, Colonel General Heinz Guderian listened as engineers presented plans for a new super-heavy tank. Guderian was 53 years old, the father of German armored warfare, the man who had invented blitzkrieg. He hated everything he heard. "Gentlemen," Guderian said, his voice cold with contempt, "you are proposing to build a fortress, not a tank. A tank must move. A tank must maneuver. What you are describing cannot do either. Too heavy to fight." That phrase would define the Maus before a single prototype was built. General Walter Model, present at the meeting, nodded in agreement. What good is armor that cannot reach the battlefield? But Hitler had already seen the designs. Hitler wanted the Maus. And in the Third Reich, what Hitler wanted, Hitler received. Guderian's warning was ignored. The project continued. "We are building a monument to our own stupidity," Guderian told his aide after the meeting. "And we will pay for it in steel, in labor, and in time we do not have." He was right, but no one was listening. The Maus was born from Hitler's obsession with size. Since 1941, the Führer had demanded increasingly heavy tanks. The Panzer IV was too light. The Tiger was not heavy enough. The Tiger II was still insufficient. Hitler wanted something invincible, a land battleship that could withstand any weapon and destroy any enemy. In March 1942, he summoned Ferdinand Porsche to the Reich Chancellery. Porsche was already famous. His designs had created the Volkswagen Beetle and the Tiger tank. Now Hitler wanted something bigger. "I want a tank that cannot be destroyed," Hitler told Porsche. "Weight is no object. Armor is everything." Porsche accepted the commission. He would design a tank weighing over 100 tons with armor thick enough to stop any shell, armed with a 128 millimeter gun capable of destroying any enemy vehicle at over 3 kilometers. The engineering challenges were staggering. A 188-ton vehicle required a suspension system that did not exist. Conventional tracks would shatter under the weight. The transmission had to transfer power from 2 massive engines, a Daimler-Benz MB509 producing 1,200 horsepower, to tracks that were over 1 meter wide. And then there was the fundamental problem. How do you move 188 tons across a battlefield? The answer, Porsche discovered, was slowly, very slowly. The Maus had a maximum road speed of 20 kilometers per hour. Cross-country, it could barely manage 13 kilometers per hour. A healthy man could outrun it at a jog. Worse, it could not cross any bridge in Europe. The maximum load capacity of German military bridges was 60 tons. The Maus weighed 3 times that. Rivers would have to be crossed underwater, using a snorkel system that required a second Maus to supply electrical power. 2 tanks to cross 1 river. This was the reality of the Maus. But Hitler did not care about logistics. He cared about invincibility. And the Maus on paper was invincible. Production began in late 1943. 2 prototypes were ordered. Then the number was raised to 150. Then reality intervened. Building the Maus consumed resources Germany could not spare. The Alket factory in Berlin, one of the Reich's most important armor producers, was assigned to construct the hulls. Krupp would build the turrets. The assembly would take place at facilities scattered across Germany to avoid Allied bombing. Each Maus required approximately 100 tons of high-quality armor steel. In 1944, Germany's total monthly steel production was barely sufficient to build 1,500 Panzerkampfwagen. Building 150 Maus tanks would have consumed steel that could have produced 10,000 medium tanks instead. The engines were equally problematic. The MB 509 was derived from an aircraft engine, one that was desperately needed for fighters. Each Maus required 2. Every supertank meant 2 fewer aircraft defending German cities. Dr. Porsche pushed his engineers relentlessly. The first prototype, V1, was completed in December 1943. It had a dummy turret, a weighted mock-up to simulate the mass, because Krupp had not finished the real one. Testing began immediately. The results were discouraging. The Maus consumed fuel at a rate of 4 liters per kilometer. A full tank, 2,650 liters, would be exhausted in less than 200 kilometers. In a war where Germany was already rationing fuel, the Maus was an impossible luxury. The suspension groaned under the weight. Track links snapped during turns. The engines overheated constantly. At one point, the Maus sank into soft ground and required 3 recovery vehicles to extract. "We have built a dinosaur," one engineer wrote in his diary. "Impressive to look at, unable to survive." By spring 1944, the second prototype, V2, was complete. This one had a functional turret armed with a 128mm KWK-44 gun and a coaxial 75mm gun. On the firing range, the weapons performed flawlessly, but the Maus could not reach the firing range without breaking down. In June 1944, Albert Speer cancelled the Maus program. The decision was purely practical. Germany was losing the war. The Allies had landed in Normandy. Soviet forces were advancing on all fronts. The Reich needed tanks that could be built quickly, deployed easily, and maintained with limited resources. The Maus was none of these things. "We cannot afford monuments," Speer told Hitler. "We need weapons." Hitler resisted. He loved the Maus, loved its size, its armor, its symbolic power, but even he could not ignore reality forever. The program was suspended. The 2 prototypes would be completed, but no production run would follow. Porsche received the news at Böblingen. He had devoted 2 years to the Maus. He had solved engineering problems that no one had ever attempted, and now his creation would never see battle. "The tragedy," Porsche wrote to his son, "is not that we failed. It is that we succeeded in building something that should never have been built." The 2 Maus prototypes were transferred to the Kummersdorf testing ground near Berlin. They would wait there, useless giants while the war collapsed around them, too heavy to fight. Guderian had been right all along. While the Maus sat idle at Kummersdorf, Germany's real tank war was being lost. In July 1944 at Kursk, the Soviets deployed over 6,000 tanks against German forces. The Germans responded with Panthers and Tigers, fast, deadly, but vastly outnumbered. The battle became a war of attrition that Germany could not win. Soviet T-34s were being produced at a rate of 1,200 per month. Each T-34 required a fraction of the steel, labor, and fuel of a single Maus. If just 10 Maus tanks had been completed, the resources could have built over 1,000 T-34 equivalents. At the same moment, at American factories in Detroit, M4 Shermans rolled off assembly lines 24 hours a day. The Sherman was inferior to the Panther in armor and firepower, but there were so many of them that it did not matter. Quantity was its own quality. The Maus represented the opposite philosophy. One perfect weapon instead of 1,000 adequate ones. Invincibility instead of availability. It was a philosophy that had already failed. In August 1944, Guderian, now chief of the Army General Staff, visited Kummersdorf to inspect the Maus prototypes. He walked around V2, examining the massive turret, the impossibly thick armor, the guns that could destroy any tank ever built. Then he shook his head. "This is what we spent 2 years building," he said to his aide. "A tank that cannot move, cannot be transported, and cannot be fueled. We have achieved perfection, and it is perfectly useless." At the same time, Soviet engineers were examining captured German vehicles and laughing. They had encountered Tigers and Panthers. They respected them. But when reports of the Maus reached Moscow, the reaction was disbelief. "They have built their own coffin," one Soviet general remarked, "and it is very heavy." The Maus would never meet a T-34 in combat. It would never prove or disprove its designer's claims. It would simply sit, waiting for a battle that would never come. In April 1945, the Soviet army reached Kummersdorf. The testing ground was defended by a skeleton force, old men and boys with rifles facing a tidal wave of Soviet armor. Among the German positions sat the 2 Maus prototypes, V1 and V2. The Maus tanks were theoretically operational. Their guns were loaded. Their fuel tanks held enough diesel for a few kilometers of movement. For the first time in their existence, they faced actual enemies. They did not fight. The German commanders at Kummersdorf made a decision. The Maus must not fall into Soviet hands intact. The prototypes were too valuable as intelligence. The Soviets could not be allowed to study their design. On April 21, 1945, demolition charges were placed inside both vehicles. V1's turret was destroyed. V2 was more thoroughly wrecked. The engine compartment was blown apart, the interior gutted by fire. When Soviet soldiers reached the testing ground, they found 2 massive hulks, still smoking, surrounded by scattered debris. The largest tanks ever built had been destroyed by their own creators. Soviet engineers immediately began examining the wreckage. They were astonished by what they found. The armor was incredible, thicker than anything they had encountered. The gun could have destroyed any Soviet tank at extreme range. The engineering, despite all its flaws, represented a genuine achievement. But the Soviets also saw the Maus's fatal weaknesses: the immobility, the fuel consumption, the impossibility of mass production. They took notes, photographed everything, and ultimately decided not to pursue similar designs. The Maus had taught them a valuable lesson. There is a limit to how big a tank should be. One vehicle, assembled from the turret of V2 and the hull of V1, was shipped to the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow. It remains there today, the only surviving Maus, a monument to ambition unchecked by reality. Ferdinand Porsche survived the war. He was arrested by Allied forces, held for 20 months, and eventually released without charges. In later years, he rarely spoke about the Maus. When asked, he acknowledged both the achievement and the failure. "We proved it could be done," Porsche said. "We built a 188-ton tank that could move, that could shoot, that could function. That was the achievement." He paused. "The failure was building it at all. We answered a question no one should have asked. too heavy to fight. Guderian's warning had been proven correct. The Maus was an engineering triumph and a strategic disaster, a weapon that consumed resources Germany desperately needed for a capability Germany could never use. The Maus at Kubinka remains the only surviving example. It sits in a climate-controlled hangar, preserved exactly as the Soviets assembled it in 1946. Visitors can walk around its massive hull, peer at the 128mm gun, and try to comprehend its scale. The tank weighs more than 3 modern M1 Abrams tanks combined. Its armor is thicker than the walls of medieval castles. Its gun could destroy any vehicle on Earth in 1945, and it never fired a shot in combat. Other super-heavy tank projects followed: the Soviet Object 279, the American T-28, but none reached production. The lesson of the Maus had been learned. Mobility matters more than armor, quantity matters more than quality, and the perfect weapon is worthless if it cannot reach the battlefield. History remembers the Maus as an engineering curiosity, and it was. The heaviest tank ever built, with armor that could not be penetrated and guns that could not be matched. But the Maus was also a symptom of desperation, a regime that believed bigger weapons could compensate for strategic failure. They had the steel. They had the engineers. What they lacked was the wisdom to know when enough was enough. Today, visitors to the Kubinka Tank Museum can see the only surviving Maus. It dominates its hangar, a steel dinosaur from a vanished age. Children climb on replicas. Veterans shake their heads. Engineers still marvel at what Porsche achieved and what that achievement cost, but the lesson of the Maus endures, too heavy to fight. Guderian knew it before the first prototype rolled. Some weapons are built to win battles. Others are built to satisfy egos. The Maus was 188 tons of the latter, a monument to the folly of believing that size alone can conquer. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Stuttgart to Siberia, from engineers to enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.